In the early morning hours of Friday, August 13th, 1982, an invisible weapon was deployed from the high-rise towers of New York and London. It wasn't a missile, it wasn't a tank, it was a single, shattering telex message. That message, sent from the Mexican Treasury to the U.S. Federal Reserve, declared that Mexico could no longer service its debt. The country was, for all intents and purposes, bankrupt. To the world, this looked like a momentary crisis, an unfortunate local failure. But inside the war rooms of Wall Street and Washington, they knew it was the first tremor of a geopolitical earthquake. Mexico owed $80 billion, Brazil owed over $100 billion. Argentina, Venezuela, Chile, all were lined up behind Mexico, staring into the abyss of insolvency. This wasn't just a financial default. It was the moment that Latin America, a vast continent of sovereign nations, lost its economic independence. What followed was not an invasion of armies, but a quiet coup by accountants, bankers, and economists. The battle was fought over ledger books, interest rates, and privatization mandates. The prize was not territory, but sovereignty itself. The result was a decade known as the Lost Decade, a financial trauma that saw wealth flow out of Latin America and straight into the vaults of New York and Washington. The continent was stripped of its national assets, its public services, and its future. It was a massive involuntary transfer of wealth, achieved without a single shot being fired. This is the story of how the largest financial crisis of the 20th century delivered the resources and the strategic control of an entire continent, not to a competing empire, but to Wall Street. 1. The volcano awakens, the anatomy of a debt bomb, the illusion of prosperity. To understand the brutal seizure of the 1980s, we must first look at the illusion of prosperity that preceded it. The 1970s was a decade of financial euphoria for Latin American nations. It was fueled by an abundant, easily accessible resource, petrodollars. Following the OPEC oil price shocks of 1973 and 1979, massive dollar surpluses flooded into Western banks, particularly those in New York and London. The OPEC nations, suddenly flush with cash, needed a place to deposit billions. The banks, desperate for high-yield returns, looked south. Latin America, meanwhile, was pursuing a development strategy known as import substitution industrialization, ISI. The goal was to build up domestic industries, steel, cars, chemicals, and shield them from foreign competition using high tariffs. This required massive infrastructure projects, state-owned energy companies, and heavy government investment. These countries needed capital, and Wall Street was practically shoving it out the door. The environment was perfect for a debt bomb. Bankers in New York, armed with cheap petrodollars, convinced Latin American governments they were a safe bet. They offered loans with alluringly low interest rates, often variable rates tied to the U.S. Federal Reserve's own rate, known as the LIBOR, or London Interbank Offered Rate. From 1975 to 1982, the numbers exploded. The total debt of Latin America soared from under $50 billion to over $300 billion. Mexico borrowed heavily to develop its new oil fields. Brazil poured billions into massive hydroelectric dams and steel mills. Argentina used loans to fund ambitious military projects and prop up successive, unstable regimes. This was not a system of careful lending. It was a feeding frenzy. Banks competed fiercely to offload money, often bypassing due diligence entirely. As one banker famously put it, countries can't go bankrupt. This reckless assumption was the original sin of the crisis, the ticking time bomb. The entire house of cards was built on a single shared assumption, that U.S. interest rates would remain low, and commodity prices, oil, copper, coffee, would remain high, ensuring the borrowers could repay their debts in perpetuity. But the economic environment of the 1970s was an anomaly. The U.S. economy was suffering from chronic stagflation, high inflation coupled with stagnant growth. To combat this, in 1979, a man named Paul Volcker, the new chairman of the U.S. Federal Reserve, made a devastating decision. Volcker believed that conquering inflation, the scourge of the dollar, was the only way to save the U.S. economy. He unilaterally declared financial war on inflation. Volcker began raising the federal funds rate dramatically. Within 2 years, the rate skyrocketed from around 7% to a dizzying 20%. The effect on Latin America was catastrophic. Because almost all of the debt was tied to the floating LIBOR rate, every time Volcker pushed the button in Washington, the interest payments on the entire $300 billion debt load skyrocketed in Mexico City, Rio de Janeiro, and Buenos Aires. Suddenly, countries were not just paying interest, they were being crushed by it. For every 1% rise in the U.S. interest rate, Latin America owed an additional $3 billion. Furthermore, Volcker's tight money policy triggered a global recession, causing a collapse in commodity prices. The very copper, coffee, and oil that Latin America relied upon to earn the U.S. dollars needed to pay the interest now sold for drastically less. The countries were caught in the perfect financial vice. Their income plummeted while their interest payments exploded. The August Alarm. By the summer of 1982, the situation became untenable. Mexico, the region's second-largest economy and a symbol of oil-rich prosperity, was bleeding dollar reserves. On August 13, 1982, the Mexican finance minister, Jesus Silva Herzog, flew to Washington to deliver the humiliating news. Mexico could not make its upcoming payment. It needed a loan to pay its existing interest. This moment, the Mexican weekend, was the official start of the lost decade. The Western banks instantly realized that they were exposed. A Mexican default would trigger a chain reaction, possibly causing the collapse of major Wall Street institutions like Citibank and Chase Manhattan, which had enormous Latin American exposure. The U.S. government intervened immediately, organizing a short-term bailout to keep Mexico afloat. But this was not a rescue. It was merely a staging operation. Washington knew it had to find a way to manage the $300 billion debt while simultaneously protecting its banks and, critically, securing a new geopolitical reality in Latin America. The time for easy money was over. The time for the quiet coup had begun. 2. The creditors' leverage. The Washington Consensus is born. The creditors unite. The Mexican crisis revealed a terrifying truth to the American and European banks. They couldn't afford to let their clients fail. Their survival was intertwined with the survival of the debtor nations. The initial reaction was panic, followed by a coordinated, ruthless strategy. The banks, which had competed to lend, now united to dictate terms. They formed steering committees, led by the largest creditors like Citicorp, and refused to negotiate with the debtors individually. The power dynamic had shifted 180 degrees. The debtors, once courted with lavish dinners, were now supplicants begging for extensions. The bank's strategy was simple: extend and pretend. They would extend the loan maturity dates, but they would not reduce the principal debt, nor would they reduce the crushing variable interest rates. They simply repackaged the debt, adding new interest onto the old principal, ensuring the debt loads would become perpetual. This was the financial logic of the debt trap. The country had to continue to borrow, just to pay the interest on the previous debt. But the banks and the U.S. Treasury knew that debt restructuring alone wasn't enough. They needed institutional leverage. They needed to ensure that the debtor countries prioritized debt repayment over all other domestic needs: education, health, infrastructure. And they found their instrument of control in 2 institutions created 40 years earlier at Bretton Woods: the International Monetary Fund, IMF, and the World Bank. The IMF's poison pill. When a debtor country like Mexico or Brazil came to the table begging for a temporary bridge loan, a financial tourniquet, the banks told them they would not participate until the nation had secured the home seal of approval from the IMF was ostensibly a neutral lender of last resort. In reality, it operated under a doctrine heavily influenced by the U.S. Treasury, the largest shareholder. The IMF's approval came not in the form of a gift, but as a poison pill known as conditionality. To receive an IMF loan, which was always smaller than the country as needs but necessary to unlock subsequent bank negotiations, the nation had to sign a Structural Adjustment Program, SAP. The SAPs were a mandatory, uniform prescription for economic reform, dictated from Washington, regardless of the country's unique domestic situation. These conditions were designed to achieve 3 key outcomes: generate cash for repayment, mandate sharp cuts in government spending, austerity, and raise taxes to generate a fiscal surplus, which would be immediately earmarked for debt servicing. Increase exports, devalue the currency dramatically. This made local goods cheaper for foreign buyers, but made essential imports, food, medicine, ruinously expensive for the local population. Open markets for foreign capital, dismantle protectionist ISI policies, open national borders to foreign competition, and, most crucially, privatize state-owned industries. The SAPs were not economic suggestions, they were financial ultimatums, the Washington Consensus. By the late 1980s, these IMF and World Bank conditions coalesced into a political and economic dogma known as the Washington Consensus, a term later coined by economist John Williamson. It was the ideological mechanism of the quiet coup. The consensus promoted fiscal discipline, austerity, deep cuts to social spending and subsidies, trade liberalization, removing all tariffs and opening the floodgates to cheap imported goods, privatization, the mandatory sale of state assets to private, often foreign, investors. For Latin America, this translated into a devastating reversal of their post-war development model. Subsidy removal, food and fuel subsidies, which kept the peace in volatile cities, were stripped away, leading to sharp price increases and immediate social unrest. The 1989 Caracazo riots in Venezuela. Devaluation. The rapid collapse of national currency values wiped out the savings of the middle class and made foreign currency debt, mortgages, business loans impossible to pay. Privatization. This was the ultimate objective of the quiet coup. National telephone companies, oil fields, airlines, steel mills, and electrical grids, assets built up over decades of national investment, were suddenly put on the global auction block. The irony was brutal. The very nations that were supposed to be rescued were now forced to sell their most valuable national assets at fire sale prices to the same foreign banks and corporations that held their debt. Latin American governments were forced into the role of distressed asset managers, selling off the family silver just to pay the interest on the mortgage. The quiet coup had succeeded in exchanging sovereignty for a perpetually revolving line of credit. 3. The fire sale, selling the family silver, the debt for equity swap. The privatization frenzy that swept Latin America in the late 1980s was one of the largest, fastest transfers of public wealth to private hands in modern history. And it was achieved through an innovative, complex financial instrument designed to simultaneously solve two problems: the banks, debt exposure, and the debtors, lack of cash. This instrument was the debt for equity swap. Here is how the mechanism of the fire sale worked. The discount. A U.S. bank, e.g. Chase, held $100 million of Brazilian government debt. Knowing Brazil would likely never repay the full amount, the bank sold that debt on the secondary market for a steep discount, perhaps 50 cents on the dollar, for a cash return of $50 million. The swap. A multinational corporation, e.g. General Motors, or a U.S. investment fund, bought that $100 million debt note for $50 million. They then took the debt note to the Brazilian central bank. The exchange. The central bank, desperately trying to reduce its foreign currency debt, agreed to pay the corporation $90 million, or another high percentage, in local currency, cruzeiros, the acquisition. The corporation immediately used these newly acquired local currency funds to buy a state asset, a newly privatized telecommunications company, a power plant, or an airline, at a deeply discounted price. The benefit to the debtor nation was minimal. They reduced their foreign debt by $100 million, but only by increasing the local currency money supply, fueling inflation. And more importantly, selling a long-term revenue-generating asset to a foreign entity. The beneficiaries were massive. The banks. They cleared bad debt from their books and took a loss, but survived the crisis. The corporations, trust funds. They were able to acquire strategic national assets for a fraction of their market value. They bought a $100 million factory for $50 million of discounted debt. It was the deal of the century. The telecommunications takeover. The most visible and lucrative targets of this privatization wave were the state-owned utilities, particularly telecommunications and energy. These assets were guaranteed income generators, essential to national security, and monopolized the most profitable sectors of the economy. Mexico's Telmex, Telefonos de Mexico, became the centerpiece of this transfer. After decades of state ownership, the telecommunications giant was privatized in 1990. While the sale was framed as a necessary step to modernize the network, the asset was acquired by a private consortium at a valuation that many economists argued was ridiculously low. The effect was immediate. Investment flowed in, but so did control, and the new private owners enjoyed a near monopoly that generated immense private wealth. Argentina's privatization program under President Carlos Menem was equally aggressive, selling the national airline, the railway system, and the state oil company, YPF. The sales were often conducted under immense pressure from the IMF and the World Bank to meet debt targets, leading to questionable transparency and fire sale valuations. The impact on infrastructure and public services was devastating. While some capital was invested, the core goals were profit extraction, not public service. Utilities often focused on serving the wealthiest urban centers, while neglecting poor or rural areas. National development priorities were now subordinate to the profit mandates of foreign shareholders. The lost decades scar. By the end of the 1980s, the financial figures revealed the true cost of the quiet coup. Negative transfer of wealth. Between 1982 and 1990, Latin America transferred an estimated $220 billion in real terms back to creditor nations in the form of interest payments. Now, this was wealth that should have been invested in schools, hospitals, and roads. Social collapse. Austerity measures slashed government spending. Healthcare budgets plummeted, and per capita, income dropped by nearly 10% across the continent. This period was accurately named the Lost Decade, because, in terms of human and economic development, the continent had gone backward by a full generation. The debt persisted. Despite the massive transfer of wealth and the selling of national assets, the total debt load for Latin America only increased, rising from $300 billion in 1982 to over $400 billion by 1990. They had sold their sovereignty and were still deeper in debt. The result of the Washington Consensus was not a stable, free market paradise. It was a continent deeply scarred by inequality, deindustrialization, and financial dependence. The quiet coup had stripped Latin America of its ability to independently choose its own economic destiny. The final chapter of this tragic saga, the slow, painful realization of the cost, was still being written. 4. The legacy of dependence, sovereign chains. The Brady Plan, the final acknowledgement. By the early 1990s, even Washington and Wall Street had to acknowledge that the extend and pretend strategy was unsustainable. The debt trap was crippling the debtors, and the banks still held massive amounts of non-performing loans. A new solution was needed, one that, for the first time, acknowledged the need for debt reduction. This led to the Brady Plan, introduced in 1989 by U.S. Treasury Secretary Nicholas Brady. The Brady Plan was hailed as a breakthrough because it allowed commercial banks to voluntarily restructure or reduce the principal debt owed by the debtor nations. In exchange for this haircut, the remaining debt was securitized into new financial instruments called Brady bonds. These Brady bonds were different. They were guaranteed in part by U.S. Treasury zero-coupon bonds, which the debtor nations had to purchase and hold as collateral. This meant the interest payments on Brady bonds were highly secure, virtually eliminating the risk for the creditor banks. The benefit was that it provided some limited debt relief and allowed countries to re-enter global capital markets. The cost, however, was finality. By collateralizing the debt with U.S. instruments, the debtor nations essentially pledged a portion of their future revenues to guarantee payment to the banks. This act formalized and solidified the debt into a long-term, highly secured obligation. The Brady Plan was not an act of charity. It was the final mortgage signing of the quiet coup. The banks got secure assets, and the countries got a permanent, guaranteed financial tether to the West. The human cost of austerity, the most devastating legacy of the lost decade and the structural adjustment programs, was the collapse of the middle class and the rise of extreme poverty and social volatility. The economic pain inflicted by austerity measures, the instant removal of subsidies, the freezing of government wages, and the mass privatization-driven layoffs created a fertile ground for political extremism and instability. Peru. The early 1990s saw the IMF's rigid structural adjustment recommendations implemented with devastating effect. The resulting economic shock and social alienation fueled the rise of the violent Shining Path, Sendero Luminoso, insurgency, demonstrating how financial instability can directly translate into national security crises. Mexico. The social upheaval following the debt crisis and subsequent economic liberalization created a widening gap between the prosperous North and the marginalized South, a key factor leading to the 1994 Zapatista uprising in Chiapas. The message was clear. The quiet coup had sacrificed social stability at the altar of financial stability for the creditor nations. The price of repaying Wall Street was borne by the poorest citizens of Latin America, the new masters of influence. The long-term geopolitical consequence of the quiet coup was the entrenchment of a new, non-military dependency. Before the 1980s, a Latin American government had the political luxury of choosing its own industrialization path. After the quiet coup, all major economic decisions were pre-approved by the global financial troika, the IMF, the World Bank, and the major New York banks. Any new government coming to power, regardless of its ideological mandate, understood the rules. Stray too far from the Washington consensus, and the IMF loan window would close, capital markets would dry up, and the economy would face immediate collapse. The new masters of influence were not ambassadors or generals, but ratings agencies, hedge funds, and chief economists. They controlled the flow of capital, and capital was the only thing that could keep the national economy from sinking. This financial dependency allowed foreign entities to gain unprecedented access and control over strategic resources, far exceeding what was achieved by 19th century gunboat diplomacy. The ultimate irony is that Latin America was not forced to sell its national assets to repay loans from the IMF/World Bank. The loans were mostly from commercial banks. But the IMF/World Bank used their institutional authority to force the asset sales to protect the commercial banks. The quiet coup of the 1980s was a demonstration that in the modern era, debt is the ultimate weapon of conquest. It proved that a nation can win the political battle for self-determination, but lose the financial war for economic independence. They traded the possibility of a catastrophic, brief default for a long-term, crippling surrender of sovereignty. The price of short-term survival was a permanent position of financial subservience. The chains were not made of iron, but of interest and collateral. I'm John, and this is the Cinematic History Tales channel. Subscribe now to stay ahead of the curve, because when the history books are written, you'll want to be among the few who saw the true price of that telex message, sent on a quiet Friday morning.